Maemura, PhD candidate at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information. Her research focuses on Web Archives collections, humanity research infrastructures, and the sociotechnical processes and decisions applied in data curation practices. Her research work has been informed by several collaborations, and I am especially excited by her 3-month research stay here in Denmark in 2018, working with Niels Brügger at Aarhus University and myself and my colleagues at the Royal Danish Library. And you know, Emily, we would have loved to have you here in Europe again, but it's also very great to have you here on the screen. And we know you've been busy thinking and writing, and we are very excited to hear from you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I, of course, would have loved to be there in person today too, but I'm very happy to be here virtually and to talk about my research. So let me just get my screen sharing started. Great. So I also just want to make sure the sound is working for everyone. Yes. So good afternoon, or perhaps for some of you, good morning, and thank you for having me here at WARCnet. I'm delighted to be here to speak about my study of web archives and the humanities-centered research infrastructures that support the scholarly use of data from these collections. So through my doctoral research, I've approached this from the perspective of infrastructure studies, looking at the holistic view of data collection and use. So really all of the systems and people involved, including librarians, curators, and technical developers. And as the title of my talk suggests, today I want to emphasize how my findings can be used to develop a new approach to describing archived web data and highlighting data's specific relationships to these socio-technical infrastructures that produce and sustain them. But first, I'll begin by positioning my work within the emerging field of web archive studies. So my work began just after a kind of key turning point in the field where large institutions like national libraries have now established web archiving programs for many years, or in some cases decades. And their web archives collections have grown to very large volumes of data, getting into the hundreds of terabytes. These institutions have also identified the need for researcher engagement and the challenges presented by certain access restrictions, which often mirror the closed reading room access policies that have been developed for their counterpart analog collections. So this means that digital collections like web archives are beholden to similar copyright restrictions. Around 2010 to 2014, there were various reports published on research engagement specifically, and calling for the field to invest in search and analysis interfaces, supporting a shift in methodology to address the scale of big data. And this is what others like Helen Hawks-Yu and Anat Ben-David and Hugo Herdeman have described as a shift from document-centric to whole collection approaches. So what this kind of looks like is that to meet researcher needs, when dealing with the scale of data, it's no longer sufficient to just search and browse page by page, as you might see in the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine interface, shown kind of on the left here. But instead, more researchers are interested in the raw data that's underlying these web pages, captured in the form of web archive or WARC files, as I'm sure many of you know from WARCnet. But in the past several years, these whole collection approaches have inspired the development of research infrastructures, including new tools, interfaces, high-performance computing facilities that are specifically built to support this kind of computational humanities work. So an example on this slide is from the UK Web Archive. Their Shine search tool and interface is powered by a Solr index that allows a user to search and track keywords and trends in the collection over time. Another example comes from Denmark and the Royal Library, whose analysis of the Netarchive collection developed some of these visualizations like the relative amount of data by media type. So here you see kind of audio, image, text, video, and other types of media, and how they're represented in the collection over time, over many years. So these are just some brief examples of the different analyses that can be performed with more big data approaches, and what this can start to reveal to researchers. Of course, there are many other analysis tools and search functions also being developed. But alongside these, the development of these tools and interfaces, recent work has also started to describe a process model for how researchers are exploring and analyzing a collection's data. So here we see the FEAV, filter, extract, aggregate, and visualize model from several authors from the Archives Unleashed project. And these tools and this model are, again, kind of built around the analysis of Web Archives data files, particularly those in the WARC format. And then through this process, other data files and derivatives may be generated that are of a smaller size and easier to process for research purposes. But what I want to highlight here is how there's kind of something left out of the FEAV model, which is all the decisions made upon data before the research starts. So the processes of selection and curation performed before the research team receives this collection of work files. Others have kind of already described this challenge of determining what happened to the data before the research starts. So for example, in his recent monograph, History in the Age of Abundance, Ian Milligan presents this from the perspective of a historian. And in this excerpt here, he notes that, in spite of the challenge for generating detailed documentation at a large scale, revealing the algorithm used to select sites, for example, or the top level decision-making or objectives that may have led to a given site being collected can help us, historians, at least write informed histories. Similarly, Niels Brugger, in his monograph on the archived web, notes the importance of provenance information. He says that provenance information may exist in some of the metadata that are created as part of the processes of archiving and displaying archived content. That is, documents outlining the decisions about what should be archived, the crawl log, CDX index files. All this information may comprise a treasure trove for web historians who are trying to establish the provenance of what is in a web archive, what should have been archived, why it did end up there, and when. Unfortunately, this type of information is only rarely made available to researchers. So this is kind of where I've been starting, that researchers are recognizing that these things are important. Algorithmic transparency is important. There's a need to understand the kind of computational logics for selection and exclusion that influence what is recorded in the data sets that are made available to researchers. And there's also a recognition of the vital information recorded in log files, metadata, indexes, and other documentation. But where my work comes in is that I want to also kind of complicate the idea that these computational forms of documentation and an understanding of algorithms alone will solve this problem of a collection's provenance. Rather, I believe that algorithms themselves do not tell the whole story behind the data. So my study kind of approaches this through the broader socio-technical context that shape data, including how people, organizations, processes, and systems work together to determine the construction of a collection. Another key aspect of my work is looking at how, when, and where individual curators intervene in computational processes, meaning that this seemingly automated work of the crawler does not always function according to predictable logics or outcomes. So I argue that this can only be studied through an ethnography of infrastructure, as has previously been described by Susan Lee Starr's work and Jeff Bowker, that highlights how infrastructures consist of socio-technical relationships and how decisions are made within particular contingencies and constraints of a given context. So in my doctoral work, I conducted an ethnographic study focused on two key settings where research infrastructures are being developed for archived web data. As Dita mentioned, the first part of my study was in Denmark, where in early 2018, I studied the Royal Danish Library's work and their longstanding national legal deposit collection, the Netarchive. And the Netarchive has captured the Danish web since 2005. During my fieldwork, I focused in particular on the partnership between the Royal Library and researchers from Aarhus University's NetLab, where they've collaborated on a pilot project testing the National Cultural Heritage Cluster high-performance computing infrastructure with their project Probing a Nation's Web Domain. Then in the latter half of 2018, I looked at a site in Canada and studied the research infrastructure being developed by the Archives Unleashed project, especially the data processing and analysis options provided by their cloud and toolkit, and how that was used during a datathon run by their team. So this is a 2-day hackathon style event where local and international participants collaborate in small ad hoc teams of researchers, librarians, and developers. And in that setting, I also draw on discussions that I had with librarians who created the collections that were analyzed at the datathon, which are ArchiveIt, event and subject-based collections from the University of British Columbia, UBC libraries, and the University of Victoria libraries. So in terms of the research design, I position myself alongside this work and these projects, studying the challenges that arise as data are transferred between systems to new social and technical contexts in order to study the selection and curation decisions made by different people and tools. And in addition to interviews and participant observation at these sites, I extend the ethnography of infrastructure to include elements of document analysis. So I looked at project plans and work plans and other policies and organizational artifacts. And I performed some systems analysis and modeling of tools like ArchiveIt and the Netarchive Suite, looking at their entities and data structures that they used. So ultimately, in studying these developing web archives research infrastructures and collaborative projects, I'm motivated by this question of what is or isn't included in the data. And I kind of take that to mean, WARCS as the primary data artifacts that are the objects of computational analysis. Additionally, I want to acknowledge that the data a researcher sees has moved through different collecting and archiving systems over time. I want to understand which parts of those systems are determined by computational logics and algorithms, or by other kinds of decisions and interventions. And broadly, I'm looking at how these socio-technical systems curate, aggregate, select, extract, manipulate, or transform data. And I recognize that there's been this kind of gap between researchers and collectors, since research tools and interfaces and computing facilities all tend to be built around the analysis of this raw data from work files. And those analyses then don't capture some of the messier decisions or types of documentation that we see that are generated about the data throughout the collecting process. But those documents are really vital to understanding and reading meaning into these collections. So I've kind of focused in my research on describing and contextualizing both data and data practices by drawing on the work of infrastructure studies, emphasizing the people involved and the sometimes invisible work that doesn't appear in these more formal data representations. Or to put it more simply, maybe I'm asking here kind of, how can we start to look beyond WARCS in the analysis of data from these collections and find ways to complement statistical or computational readings of data with understandings of the other socio-technical factors that shape these collections? And so I'll review here a few examples that highlight how context and scale shape these web archives collections and the different other factors that impact how decisions are made. And more specifically, I'll compare different systems and processes used for curating data from different collections. So a first observation is that all collections I've seen do tend to have these kinds of systems to manage collection development that are separate from the harvester or crawler software. So these systems are used in the process of collecting, where sometimes curators need to mediate or intervene and kind of manage the crawler's automated work. And overall, these management systems are necessary because crawlers don't always run smoothly, automatically, or as expected. So through these examples, I want to reveal first how a collection is managed at each site, and second, how these systems are designed to fit within the specific needs and contingencies of that collection's context. So the first example is from the University of British Columbia Libraries. They use a Google Sheet template as a central part of their process for Web Archives collection development. So the curators, in this case librarians, coordinate multiple processes in one place. So they're using this spreadsheet to document seed URLs. They add notes to perform quality assurance or QA checks. They're annotating and adding metadata, and they're also assigning tasks to different members of the library team working on the collection. So this specific example is from a particular collection, the Site C project, which has captured web pages around the proposed hydro dam in northern BC and the controversy and response from local environmental activists and First Nations communities that are impacted by the development. So the spreadsheet is composed of several different individual sheets. You can maybe see along the bottom here, they're listed in each tab. And these are used at different times within the collecting workflow. But here we're looking at the confirmed seed spreadsheet, which lists seed URLs that have already been input to Archive-It to be crawled. So overall, this is a fairly large spreadsheet. It uses 22 columns to record various information. There's the title, the main URL for that seed. There's a description, which is whether it's captured as one page or multiple pages in Archive-It. There's a content type category, which is added by curators to distinguish if the seed is about, editorial articles or official government documents. There are these two interesting columns that capture important content to capture and priority. So those both kind of guide the QA processes and highlight where curators may need to take more time and care in QA. And for others that are less of a high priority, they may take a little less time or they're not as important. There's also two columns here noted for frequency. So one lists the options available in Archive-It, which has these set limits of, I think it's, daily, monthly, weekly, quarterly, and another for desired frequency. So this is for curators to know options that may not be automatically available in Archive-It, something like every 2 weeks, but a different kind of schedule that they want to capture the materials using. Again, it's a very large sheet, so there are just some more columns listed here. A couple are for copyright. One, again, kind of summarizes the terms of use, and then another provides the link out to the specific page that records copyright restrictions for that website. And some of the other columns that I found interesting were kind of interfacing with the Archive-It system and its standard set of inputs and outputs. So the detailed view here shows one called added as seed in Archive-It ? And this is a column configured with a VLOOKUP formula that performs an automatic check against another sheet within the spreadsheet that contains the output from Archive-It, the standard seed report. So it's just a way for them to check. And there's this little note, comment explaining how that works from the person who's actually a library grad student who created this whole spreadsheet template. So she's explaining the formula, how to perform the check when you see false, and how to look for other formatting errors with URLs. So what I want to highlight from this one example from UBC is that first, it is designed to track and manage all these different curation decisions, but also it's built in response to a very certain set of conditions that characterize that collection's context. So in terms of technical decisions or technical systems, it's designed around Archiveit and its data structures and entities and what's available kind of off the shelf from Archiveit or other options that curators might want but are hard to implement. Curators are also concerned with legal constraints, particularly copyright issues and fair dealing, which restricts what university libraries in Canada can or can't collect. There's organizational factors managed through this sheet, including assigning tasks to certain people within given work plans and available human resources. And this only works kind of at this scale because these collections are fairly small. They mostly have fewer than 100 seeds. And there's also this kind of socio-technical aspect of managing data budgets, which are associated with real costs to the library for the Archiveit subscription. So this leads librarians to closely monitor the data volumes used for each Web Archives collection and to set these priorities of which seeds or sites should get more attention and which are most important to capture in full. And also even the whole form that the document takes as this Google Sheet is kind of reflective of the context. Curators had formerly had this information on their intranet, but since they were relying heavily on graduate student workers to develop their Web Archives collections with the library school at UBC, they needed to find something more flexible for sharing and having those students contribute, since graduate students don't have full-fledged IT credentials to sign into their library intranet. So now shifting to a very different context and at a very different scale, I want to turn to an example from the Netarchive and their system developed for managing and curating data from broad harvests. So these broad harvests are one of 3 core collecting strategies, and they include materials from over 1 million domains or seed URLs. 4 broad harvests are collected per year. And in terms of scale, 1 broad harvest can include over 37 terabytes of data. So to manage the scale of collecting, curators rely on some built-in features of Netarchive Suite harvesting software developed and used by the Royal Library. So Netarchive Suite has this built-in kind of 2-step process. In step 1, a small data limit is applied to all domains, which are crawled over several days. And then in step 2, Netarchive Suite will have stored and kind of used those results of step 1, and it will recrawl only those domains that exceeded the initial small data limit. So somewhere in the range of 80,000 of these larger domains will be captured with the higher data limit set, and this takes several weeks to complete step 2. However, I learned that determining the step 2 limit for each domain is not an entirely automatic process. It's not done all by Netarchive Suite, but there's these reviews by curators who aim to balance getting complete sites, but not capturing unwanted data into the collections, which can add a significant amount of data at that scale. So these limits are set with the aid of a CSV report exported from Netarchive Suite and then explored and analyzed using Excel. So the one curator that I spoke with who manages these per domain data limits described the process as follows. So again, he imports the CSV report into Excel, resulting in a very large file of over 12,000 rows. He'll look at the information from each domain and kind of filter and sort to assign individual limits anywhere from 1 gigabyte to 12 gigabytes at these 2 gigabyte increments. He bases these decisions and raising a limit on certain rules of thumb, judging whether a domain's limits should be raised based on the number of pages or resources captured for that domain and things like the average file size. And I found this fascinating. He also uses this special limit ending in 99 as a kind of code. So for any domains that he knows provide bad data, things that are full of crawler traps, shopping sites, calendars, things like that, he'll set a limit like 3,999 megabytes instead of 4 gigabytes. And that would be a signal to himself in the future not to change that limit, since and that these domains don't need to be reviewed again. So this is a short excerpt from an interview with 2 curators describing the work that their colleague, using this Excel sheet, the limit setting that he performs. And they've kind of described earlier in the interview some of that process. So here they're saying, you know, I think if you see his Excel sheet where this other curator is doing all the stuff there, it's impressive. It's big enough. You need a 2018 computer to even render that without Excel all shutting down. And we haven't had the time for developing a program to do that, so we have to do it by ourselves. I mean, Excel and CSV files or whatever, it's a flexible thing to work with, right? If you know what you're doing. And he does. I guess it's more efficient actually than spending lots and lots of developer time speccing out what he wants and building features. But I think when he leaves, we have to do it. We'll be forced to do it. Maybe, yeah, sure, that's true. When he retires someday. So I want to highlight with this quote that there's really this expertise in using the spreadsheet for this work, and that this particular curator's decision-making with Excel is in some ways more flexible and more efficient than building a separate bit of software for that purpose. And I also really liked how this was kind of acknowledging by these colleagues describing this, how he's been working with the Netarchive for many years and has built up this experience over time to be able to do this work. So just as we saw with the example of UBC's spreadsheet, this procedure using the Netarchive Suite CSV report and Excel is designed to track and manage curation decisions. And it's also built in response to a certain set of conditions characterizing the Netarchive's context. So this includes the technical capabilities and work with the custom designed Netarchive Suite software. The legal context is very different. The Royal Library has this mandate through the legal deposit law to do broad collecting. Organizationally, we see kind of the same people and staff members working on harvests over the years, allowing these internal codes like the 99 numbers to be developed for setting limits. And then there's this kind of socio-technical decision-making where there's the malleability of the spreadsheet combined with the curator's experience and expertise to assess these site limits at scale by, you know, filtering using these metrics he's developed and looking at these kind of aggregate views of data. All of which is to say that there's kind of lots of different processes that determine what data get collected, and many of these take shapes and forms that aren't directly visible in WARCS or indexes or crawl logs. So my research calls for this broader view of data and closer considerations of organizational and cultural contexts in which data selection and curation takes place. So we can already see, you know, between these two cases, these two settings, there are very different concerns and constraints that determine how work happens. The Netarchive has this kind of longitudinal capture and is aiming for consistency over time, has the legal mandate or is fulfilling a kind of legal duty to capture the Danish web domain. And that's also demanded investment in IT developers and the creation of a software like Netarchive Suite. Whereas academic libraries in UBC, they're dealing with very different conditions and you know, labor from students who aren't going to be there in a year or 2 years necessarily, and they're really having to adapt more to these kind of off-the-shelf systems like Archive.it and mediate how they can work to meet the collection's needs. So they each have these different kind of assumptions and preconditions in each of these settings that determine what's possible. And also kind of using this lens of infrastructure studies with this kind of infrastructural approach, it highlights the importance of the different categories and classifications applied to these data and these collections, and particularly these kind of classification schemes applied by curators, which are meant for that setting, things like determining copyright or these ad hoc categories like editorial and government documents. These aren't the same as the kind of data categories that are easy to extract from work files, like media type, date and time, domain name, and HTML text fields. But these decisions made in these spreadsheets, located outside of the work, also determine how the works are even constructed, which domains go together in a certain crawl, what settings are applied to seeds, and all of that. So I think it's vital for researchers who are working with web archives to understand and be aware of these different processes of classification. But I also recognize that it can be challenging to make this documentation more widely or directly available. Some categories like editorial or government documents, that might be easier to share, but there are other things recorded in something like the UBC spreadsheet that are more difficult to share widely because of the situated nature of this information. They're noting things like, hey, Sandra, get on this quality assurance ASAP, and they might not want to share that widely and publicly. And also, one very big contingency or constraint in the Danish context, which I haven't gone into too much detail here, there are these additional legal limits on what and how data can be shared due to the data protection laws. So it may be in some case resistance from sharing more widely because of or social or organizational factors of how people feel about it. And in other cases, there may be these legal constraints. But I think generally we need to see researchers having some sense of the categories that are being tested, negotiated, and added through these different systems and spreadsheets and tools in the collecting process, and when, where, how, and by whom those decisions are made, even if the whole document is not necessarily fully available to them. So with these examples of looking kind of beyond the work and what these examples reveal, I think the main point is that here we need to find ways to both describe and account for data's socio-technical context when building new research infrastructures. Or to put it another way, when building and configuring web archives research infrastructures, we must take into account the situated and local nature of the data that we're working with. Again, this kind of connects back to understandings of data and infrastructure and their close relationships as explored in the field of infrastructure studies. And we can learn from past work that provides lessons and insights, such as from Yanni Loukissas and his book, All Data Are Local, where he cautions to look at the data setting, not just the data set. And so looking at the kind of broader context as well. From Susan Lee Starr, her work addresses the temporality and dynamics of infrastructure. And from her, we kind of learn how different components of infrastructure are distributed, meaning that infrastructure is fixed in modular increments, not globally or all at once. And I add to this that another kind of insight that this impacts how changes are reflected across data collected from different sites over time. So it's not enough to just say, take this one timestamp and use that as a way to filter and extract data, because that data from site A may have been using a completely different process, different software compared to site B, as things don't get updated necessarily at the same time globally. And then my own contribution here, kind of from my forthcoming dissertation, is that I think we need to shift attention away from algorithmic decisions and to highlight these kinds of socio-technical judgments that curators make, both with and outside of, computational logics and rules. Things like comparing and checking against the standard outputs from Archive-It, Netarchive Suite, and the crawler's reports themselves. And so I want to close here by kind of asking, what does this mean for web archives going forward? And how can we maybe think of instrumentalizing some of these ideas in our work? So first, we can kind of return to look more closely at the research infrastructures that we are building, and this recent focus on tool development, and think about what kind of reading of data these tools support. I think we can say now that the current tools we have are becoming very good at putting data together, indexing and processing raw data files, and managing this unprecedented scale of data from standardized WARC formats. But as we're kind of putting together and aggregating data sets from different institutions and covering wide spans of time, I think we need to ask, how have these data sets been created, and each within a disparate set of collecting practices shaped by their own shifting organizational policies, workloads, labor, as well as other aspects of institutional culture. And so I can envision a kind of reconfiguration of analysis tools that builds off work like these visualizations by Yanni Loukissas. So he's developed this, what he calls a temporalities application for his study of the DPLA, the Digital Public Library of America. And this application analyzes the different date formats found in that collection. So you can see here all of the actual numbers or digits are represented as dashes instead of the numbers. And this allows a researcher to kind of see the patterns in how dates and times are annotated for that collection. In his case, he's arguing against this kind of universalizing nature of the collection and highlighting the divergent practices and longer histories of these materials. But I think by applying a similar approach to web archives, we can highlight the variety of metadata formats and schemes that have been recorded in a collection over time. And that can potentially pinpoint where and when and who this data comes from. So in this way, visualizations might be used to reveal unique processes, systems, or idiosyncrasies at certain points in time within the broader archival infrastructure. This can be used, to consider data from multiple collections. As well, I think it can be used to reveal insights about the web infrastructure itself, and metadata coming from certain content management systems and how that looks or shifts over time. Another shift to kind of focus on metadata fields might lead a researcher to actually see something like the limits ending in 99 for the Netarchive, and that can help them, discover what this system was, how these limits were set, why certain sites have the 99 limit and others don't, and to understand that there is this other kind of grouping or classification at play, and hopefully that can be used in their future analysis of the collection as well. So I think in the same way that like recognizing these patterns and date formats and other metadata, we can highlight how seemingly unrelated data may have actually like similar origins. Another important aspect to embracing the kind of infrastructural approach is to really look at the local nature of data and focus on qualitative and descriptive understandings of a collection and the collection's processes in early stages of a research investigation. So kind of prior to starting any in-depth computational analysis, I think it's really important that we foreground researchers having an understanding of data's context. So this kind of idea is described in detail in a forthcoming publication by Jess Ogden and myself that highlights, a new kind of process model with initial steps that a researcher might take in working with a collection, even kind of before the FEAV process starts. So this includes tasks like orientating to the collection's specific context within a longer organizational history, a set of policies, available resources, and legal framework. A second step of auditing the data and any available documentation that describes and characterizes the collection. And finally, constructing, which is kind of constructing new concepts and new conceptual models of that collection and its data, which can further influence or guide computational analyses. So where our current model of building tools and infrastructures kind of usually starts with the researcher exploring a given set of data through these algorithms and queries, select all pages with this word from this site and this time frame. I think we need a model that also accounts for the ways in which queries might need to be adapted for the specific and situated nature of a collection. And additionally, when we shift to kind of beginning with these steps of understanding and orientating, it's important to highlight that this also demands more discussions with librarians and curators and the folks who developed these collections. So we need to frame people as a key aspect of infrastructure, a key interface, or maybe first point of contact with a collection, and not just documentation or written descriptions or a data portal as the way that researchers are starting their work with web archives. And I also, of course, want to highlight that things like that approach are already happening. And one example is from the Probing a Nation's web domain project from NetLab and the Royal Library. So this was this is work that I didn't personally kind of see this happen before my fieldwork started, but early on in the project, there were many discussions with curators to understand, which work files from which harvests should be extracted and used in the corpus that they're developing and generating for their analysis. So this includes decisions like, which data are coming from step 1 or step 2 of the broad harvest and over which years. And I really appreciate this example kind of report that they've written up for the project, which explains in detail all of these different selection criteria, the specific rationale for timeframes and reasoning for each year, understanding that there are kind of slightly different nuances to the process for each year. And on the one hand, I think this is a great kind of model moving forward for collaboration, but I also recognize that this model is also kind of demanded by the particular requirements and restrictions of the Danish context and the Danish data protection laws that kind of require to have more of these discussions and decision making, because researchers can't just grab all of the data wholesale. There are these restrictions on data movement. But again, yes, I think this is a great example and a great kind of model for future research, because there is this kind of clear statement of selection criteria and really considering the specific the specific processes for that collection. So to summarize and close, I just want to leave with kind of these 3 elements that we might consider, or maybe possible provocations for future work happening with web archives. And so the first is to consider maybe a new role on these teams and these research collaborations of something like a data ethnographer that can complement the work happening with data scientists or data engineers. So I'm envisioning that this can be someone who looks into the different documents and practices and helps, contextualize the data from work files, and then helps the whole team kind of develop a different set of classifications that can then be used in future analyses. Second, I think we do need to kind of rethink the main entry points into Web Archives collections and how we might promote more infrastructure literacy or understanding of like the broad systems and processes and people that are involved in generating data. So really promoting this kind of literacy for researchers and connecting them with people who might be able to have those conversations or help them navigate all of that infrastructure. So yeah, more importance on kind of people and librarians and curators rather than just tools. And third, I really think we need to think of embracing solutions that are centered on local data. And this is a big shift because it's not thinking in terms of broad scalability and interoperability of the tools and processes that we're developing and designing. So this requires a different kind of shift as well, which is allocating adequate resources for this work at the local level to be able to focus on local data. So I'll leave it at that, and I want to thank everyone here, and also acknowledge and thank my many collaborators and participants who've contributed and helped shape this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily Maemura. That was great, very inspiring work. And I especially appreciate you taking us behind the scenes at the archive